Welcome to Growing Guelph, the podcast that focuses on the people building and nurturing our city of Guelph, Ontario. My name is Jordan Sloggett, and I started Growing Guelph to bring awareness and focus closer to home. We live in a time where the news and media we consume is focused on a global level. That level of perspective in a world with over 8 billion people can be overwhelming. Staying informed about the state of the world is important, but I think in many ways we've traded modern hyperconnectivity with a disconnect from the places that we live. I found myself wanting to hear the stories of the people I share my city with, and to focus on people working to make our city a better place to live. Guelph is filled with inspiring, talented, passionate people who are building our community. Here on Growing Guelph, I'm looking to share conversations with people contributing to our city, whether that be contributions to the arts or programs and organizations that are serving the city. Here we'll be speaking to people who are quite literally growing Guelph. I've lived in Guelph for nearly a decade, first as a student and then intentionally coming back here to put down some roots over 4 years ago. As part of tending to those roots, consider this podcast an ongoing effort for me to give back to the city that I've made my home. If Guelph is also home for you, I encourage you to subscribe and follow me on this journey. Today, I'm thrilled to kick off our very first episode with none other than Jay Wilson. Jay is a celebrated local storyteller, actor, and the heart behind Jaywalking Guelph, the historic walking tours that bring our city's history to life. His work has helped connect generations of Guelph residents to our past, while also creating a sense of community through shared stories. He's been a creative force in Guelph for years, and I'm excited to dive into his journey, his passion for the arts, and how he uses his talents to foster connection. So with that said, let's get started with our first episode with Jay Wilson. So it might just start mid-conversation.
Yeah, that's fine.
First off, thank you very much for joining me here, Jay. This is the inaugural recording episode for Growing Guelph, project that I'm very much interested in getting going and talking to people like yourself that are making a difference in the community, bringing the community together. You have a very unique way of bringing the community together that I'm interested in and diving into today. But just to start things off, can you share a little bit about your personal journey, how you ended up settling in Guelph?
Yes, I certainly can. Guelph was sort of a fluke. It wasn't as if it was a planned choice.
Mm-hmm.
I ended up coming here because my partner's sister heard about a house that was available, and so on we came. In fact, I rent a house from the University of Guelph, which is kind of fun because I live almost on campus.
Oh, that's nice.
And I love that sort of youthful excitement and all of that intelligence and learning and stuff. It sort of keeps me young and keeps me involved in the community, which is really kind of fun. So anyway, to get back to your question about how I ended up here, as I said, it was really just a fluke. But I'm originally from Galt, Ontario, which is very similar to Guelph. We have a river running through the center of town. We have a lot of limestone buildings. So I really felt, in a way, I was kind of coming home. Mm-hmm. What I find interesting about Guelph is that when I lived in Galt, I never explored the history. You know, in the place where you're born, you just don't do that, I guess.
Yep.
But when I came here, everything was new and fascinating and interesting. And the more I would uncover, the more I wanted to uncover. So the move here has been really quite exciting. Yeah.
I really like what you had to say about the energy that the youth bring to the city, because I moved back to Guelph 4 years ago, and end of 2020. And I really look forward to September when the students come back, because you can feel just the energy and the excitement rise in the city. And I think they're why we have a strong downtown. They're why we have so many, they bring all that OSAP money and parent money into the city, but they're also, they're exploring themselves. They're trying new things. And I always get a little bit, I don't say not happy, but roll my eyes at people who want to complain about, everything the students bring. Like, is there some chaos to it? Sure. Do parties get out of control? Sure. But you said you live near campus. I'm sure you see that side of it, but that's not what you brought up. You brought up the energy and the excitement that they bring.
What's really interesting is I have a residence right behind my house. Mm-hmm. Like, it's literally almost in my backyard. And yes, the first few days, it's chaos. It's noisy. They're, settling in and everything's new and all of that. But then sort of the work kicks in and the responsibility kicks in. And suddenly they become the best neighbors in the world.
Hmm.
They're friendly, they're sociable, they're conscientious for the most part, and they're involved in being extremely curious and wanting to learn. Who wouldn't want to live in a community where there's a whole bunch of people who want to learn? I
Yeah.
mean, that's what's exciting about Guelph.
Yeah. My hometown is Niagara Falls, and funny what you said about not exploring the history of your hometown and that. There's a lot of history in Niagara Falls, obviously, that's on display everywhere. It's not really the history of the people in the neighborhoods, especially the neighborhoods built in the 50s. It's the sideshow museums and things like that. And yeah, just that, the fact that, um, I've lived someplace where the young people aren't excited to be there. In fact, there aren't a lot of young people. There's a lot of like teenagers, and then people seem to disappear, and then they move back there when they're older, or they just are there. And yeah, I would happily have the chaos of youth for everything else they bring.
Yeah.
So maybe I would have introduced you in the intro to the podcast, but I was going to ask you about what inspired you to pursue storytelling and the performing arts. But before jumping into that, do you want to just tell our listeners a little bit about what it is you do?
Sure. Well, I'm an actor by trade. Stage acting, not movies, not television, none of that. And of course, when I say I'm an actor by trade, I spent maybe less than half of my life actually acting. But I spent a lot of time in the theater, either in theater administration or fundraising or marketing and things like that. I worked for the National Tap Dance Company of Canada. I don't dance a step, but I learned a lot about the theater business and the performing arts. And so, and then I worked for Theatre Collingwood for 8 years. That was a really interesting experience because we were a producing company with no theater. I worked for the Gravenhurst Opera House, in which we had a theater and no resident theater company. So I've worked both sides of that, and that's been an interesting learning curve. But both my parents were very involved in amateur theater, so that's where my interest comes from. I wouldn't say that I'm a historian or anything like that, but suddenly as you get involved with storytelling, you start to become involved in local history because that's where a lot of stories come from. And so that's been sort of my journey. And again, not always planned. Things would just sort of pop up. So when I moved to Guelph, for example, I came here and I thought, this would be a great place to do walking tours. It'd be really interesting. And then I went, whoa, wait a minute. There's probably already somebody's thought of that. And in fact, that's exactly what I discovered. The Guelph Arts Council here has been doing walking tours since 1977, volunteer driven. The 150th anniversary of Guelph, they started this with Gordon Cooling. And those tours are really interesting, but they're architecturally based. So they talk about the limestone buildings and various other things like that, and talk a lot about the men of the community. So I volunteered with them because I wanted to learn. And then as I started to discover things, that's really how I thought, well, that's interesting. The architecture is interesting, but there are also stories of the people who lived in these buildings, the people who worked in this town, those things. I wonder what I could uncover there. And I wouldn't be competing with them. I'd be complementing what they do. And I've always been a big believer in that as well. A lot of times when you work in the performing arts, for example, it's a limited market. It's tight. It's hard to find your way. And the last thing you want to do is to come into town and burst on the scene. You want to find out what's going. You want to find out what's going on there first, and then see how you can complement it, add to it, and share and work collaboratively with what's already here. And so that's what I did, and that's when I started Jaywalking Guelph. And some of my tours are historically based, some of them aren't. Some of them are strictly sensational because I have to stay alive, I have to attract people, so I tell stories of murder and things like that. But at the core, I believe that I'm really most interested in local history and recounting those stories as best I can.
So I've been on one of your tours. I went on the Unfortunate Man tour a few years ago, which it was really eye-opening for me, and I still think about a lot of the things that you told us on that tour when I, make my way through those public spaces around Guelph, and the connection to the person, and um, a lot of times history, we can be so far removed for it that it sounds they're just facts in a book. They're just a story that's, oh, have you heard of this story of this grisly murder of this person who took out their family, and we will never know why. And I found that the mix that you brought to it of like you read newspaper stories from the time verbatim, and then you also mixed into it a little bit of maybe your personal thoughts of an interpretation of what something might have happened, and bringing some of that, the unknown in between the headline stories, into it. So when you sit down and you start, you come across a piece of local history that has an exciting element to it. What's the research like for that? Like, how do you bring all that together? How do you must, like, it must be hard to let go of something for the timing of the whole show, and like, how do you? Is that just a lot of work behind a desk, or?
Yeah, well, since we're talking about The Unfortunate Man, because it is a fascinating walking tour, it has morphed over time. So what happened was I discovered the story. It's been written about many times. Many people have written the story of The Unfortunate Man, this man who murders his family in 1889. And so what happened was, when I started, I would just tell the story. I would tell the facts, and that was, interesting enough, because the facts are quite startling. But then an odd thing happened. I also wrote it as a play, and I discovered that when I wrote it as a play, we had a play reading actually in my house one night, and brought a bunch of people in to play the various characters. And when I did that, I went, yeah, I'm still just really telling the story. I'm really just telling, this happened, and then this happened, and then this. So it was very literal, and I thought, I want to get into the skin of these people. I want to know more, and I want to be able to convey more so that other people can relate to what's going on. And then I got hit by a van. I was riding my bicycle, and I got hit by a van. And so I broke my hip, and it put me in bed, laid me up for about 3 months or so, and doing physio and things. I wasn't in bed all the time, of course. But I started going back to the story, and I started going to the newspaper accounts, as you said. I started reading what reporters had said. I started reading the testimony, the trial testimony, things that were said at the trial. I started reading about the family more and their more personal stories. And you start to get some stories coming from young Willie, the son who ends up still surviving. And you start to hear some things about his wife, Matilda, what she was thinking, and all of that. And so the story really started to unfold. And one of the things that really interested me, being an actor, is that I often look for really interesting text, because that's what it's all about, right? If you have a solid foundation, you'll have a solid performance. And that was really what struck me about that story, was the newspaper reports and the trial testimony. It was so well written. It was so interesting that I could really lift it right off the page and memorize it and recite it verbatim. And I went, oh, that's what's been missing. That's really interesting. And I find that when I do that, then what happens is, because I'm trying to transport people from the 21st century, there's cars going by, there's all kinds of modern references all around us, but I'm trying to transport them to the 19th century. And the best way to do that is to recite the language of the 19th century. Those long sentences, the use of words like pusillanimous wretch. Like, we don't say that anymore. We never say things like that. And so I discovered that language helped to transport the people to the time. And then by taking them to the locations where the event takes place, even more so. So that's how that thing unfolded. And that's how I bring sort of what I do as an artist and as a person who's interested in literature and language, and then transpose that into a walking tour. So the walking tour that I do is very different than what other walking tours are about, because they usually don't recite language from old newspaper accounts and things. They just tell you the story. And so I wanted to do more than that, and I think I've successfully done that.
As an actor, what was the process like of really that transition from you're leading people's attention on a tour and you're speaking to them, to actually trying to embody some of the characters and like kind of let go and use the public sidewalk space that you're on with a tour group as a stage. Was that a difficult place to find?
It wasn't really that difficult, no. And as it started to happen, I realized how easy that was, actually.
Mhm.
In some cases, I don't actually. It's odd. I'm an actor, so you think that I would play the other characters, and I do to some extent. But it's more really, I just change my voice and my physicality. Am I portraying what that person actually sounded like and what he looked like? No. All I'm doing really is I want to give you an idea of there's all kinds of different people who would talk at that time, and so, and you take sort of cliches, right? So
Mhm.
again, the guy who's the superintendent of the asylum, well, what's he going to talk like? He might talk, and you just change it and it just started to happen. And then what happened was certain ones started to settle in,
Mhm.
so that now the superintendent always sounds the same, and the man at the prison, he sounds the same, and and the gentleman who's the judge, he'll sound the same too. So they started to settle into what they are. But again, I didn't do a lot of digging into finding out. I wonder what his voice sounded like. I wonder what
Yeah.
he looked like. I didn't even go there. So it's been an interesting thing because I guess, well, I've used my imagination to create these characters as opposed to being true to the characters, but at the same time being very true to the story.
Mhm. I guess the stories being historical, where the tragedy is a little bit dulled with time. Not that it's still not tragic, but there's not necessarily living people with those hardships that they're still dealing with. Um, that's got to be a bit of a factor, right? Like the distance with tragedy gives us an ability to handle it, versus if the feelings are too new. If it was a murder that happened, like I would assume you wouldn't want to be covering or wouldn't be able to do a similar tour if a murder happened 5 years ago.
Absolutely. You're
Right.
absolutely right. And in fact, one of my rules is that I won't tell a story unless it's more than 100 years old,
Mm.
mainly because there could be somebody in the audience from the family. Like, you just don't know. And yes, you're right. I am horrified and shocked when I read about domestic murder, suicide, a recent one.
Hmm.
And I would never tell those stories. But as you said, there's something about the length of time, 1889. There's a disassociation with it now. I don't feel connected to those people. So I'm now able to tell that story quite comfortably without upsetting myself or my audience, really. Although they feel sadness and sorrow, but they're not distressed or anything like that. So the timing definitely helps that distance. There's an interesting thing. So, in case your listeners don't know, so the story of William Harvey is that he murders his wife and two children. He goes to murder his third child in Toronto, and that's when he's arrested. The implication is that he has a 5-shot revolver, so he was probably going to fire 2 more shots, one at his son, who he's now trying to get to, and then the final one would be his own brain. He'd shoot himself, because that's usually what happens. And in this case, he doesn't. He's apprehended and brought back to trial. Um, I do say during this tour that what fascinates me about this tour is the fact that it is a tragedy. We do try and look into why, right? So, modern society, we're always looking for why did this happen? We have a whole method of acting, right, that goes into why. What's my motivation? What's my inner? What's going on? With all kinds of actors asking themselves these questions. And as I say at the beginning of this tour, what's interesting is that with a background in historical theater, if you go back as far as Greek tragedy, they never asked those questions. They never asked why so and so was doing it. They never asked why Oedipus murders his father and marries his mother and gouges out his eyes. The gods have deemed it so.
Hmm.
Let's get on with the story. Let's find out what's going on. Tell me the story. The richness is in the story, not in the why it happened. Whereas we're more interested in modern day with the scientific view. Why? Why would he do? Why does his brain? And so I find that really interesting. And I often say that to the audience. I'm going to keep feeding you reasons why, but maybe these aren't the reasons why. Maybe we don't know why. Maybe we have no idea what was going on in his mind at all. And I think that's probably the case. We didn't know. We don't know if he's guilty of murder. We don't know if he's insane, has no recollection, as he claimed. We really have no idea. And that's what makes a story really interesting. And so I think that's why that story is still alive. And as you said, right, you go home and the story sits with you for quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a really, I don't know, just a fascinating tale. And even I can't let go of it. I keep wanting to, okay, that one's done. And then I find something more and I go, oh, how interesting. So.
Well, I found that story, the threads that are remaining, which is really just the surviving son.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I had so many follow-up questions. And I think I asked you and you were like, there's actually not very much out there about what his life was like, what he did.
That's right.
But you'd feel like, well, that's, if you were watching a film and the main character had this backstory, you'd say, what a fascinating backstory. It's going to shape the rest of his life. Like, does he ever return to Guelph? Does he have other family here? Does he say, I'm never going near that city again, as you'd understand? And I think there's just enough threads there that your brain wants it to keep going, but in that kind of satisfying way where you'll never get it. And it sort of always is there's always that potential energy there.
Everybody asks me that question at the end of the tour. And I don't even have to say, are there any questions? Somebody will say, what happened to Willie? What happened to Willie? Well, we don't really know. But everybody's curious. Everybody wants to know, how did it affect him? What happened to his life?
Mm-hmm. And in a modern true crime sort of fascination sense, he would have the opportunity to write a book and to do podcasts and
Right.
appear in interviews, and people would, there'd probably be 4-hour long YouTube videos about his life post the tragedy.
Yes.
But we don't get any of that. So we're left wanting.
We're left wanting. Yes.
You already talked about this a little bit, but how do you select the stories you share on your tours? Do you have a list somewhere of future stories that you'd love to dive into that you're just sort of piecemeal working through, or what's that? Are there any specific criteria for the themes that you follow?
No, there's no criteria. It really is what I enjoy. If I find something that I like, then I'm going to do it. And that's why I do this. I mean, I'm retired. And so jaywalking Guelph is something I just enjoy doing. Mm-hmm. And so there's no real plan. Yeah, there's all kinds of stories that I still want to tell. I keep coming across others, and yes, I sort of bank them aside and go, "Ooh, maybe that's the next one." But there's no rhyme or reason. I really just kind of sort of go out there and discover things and go, "Oh, I bet a lot of people would be interested in this." The Unfortunate Man was sort of an anomaly because it's a murder story and all of that. The other one that I do, my most popular tour, is the Guelph Early Days tour. And that one is steeped in history, and that's lots of different stories and different people. And again, came from the writing. When I first came to Guelph, I stumbled upon a book called Guelph Versifiers of the 19th Century. It's a book of verse, poetry, that was compiled by David Knight and at Vocamus Press. And it's a fascinating book of, as I said, all local versifiers, as he calls them, poets, and these poems would be published in a local newspaper. And when you think about Guelph, it's an interesting city because John Galt, the founder, is a novelist, a poet, a playwright. That's his passion. You can see that. And his beliefs and his theories about people come through in those writings. He was quite a controversial person at the time. You start to see his compassion for Indigenous people in his writings, in his other books. Not that he comes out and says that, but you can see he doesn't really like institutions. While he's a religious man, he doesn't like the institution of Christianity. Mm-hmm. He sees that power can corrupt. He sees Indigenous people as allies as opposed to British subjects, so they're partners in this. Not that the Canada Company saw it that way, but he saw it that way, and I'm finding that really interesting. And then you have John McCrae, another hugely famous poet. And I mean, yes, Flanders Fields is an incredible poem, but if you start to read his other poems, you start to see that he was playing with form and shape and all kinds of things, and wrote many, many poems that are really incredibly beautiful. And so we have this connection to writing, which is so powerful. And so when I came across this Guelph versifiers, I saw that there were lots of people writing beautiful poetry. The gentleman who comes here, Thomas Laidlaw, he's illiterate when he arrives in Guelph. So he can't read or write. He's a farmer. He teaches himself to read and write while he lives here in Guelph. And then he writes the most beautiful poem about the Speed River that I've ever read about any river. It's just such a touching piece, and it's so beautiful and it's so well constructed, and yet he came to writing so late in his life. And so these poems really started to inspire me, and I went, oh my God, there we go, right? There's the good, solid foundation. You've got a great script. Now, as an actor, turn this into something, recite these things in a way that inspires people to feel everything that's in each of those poems. And so that's what the Guelph Early Days tour sort of became. Now, it's not all poetry. Again, newspaper accounts, things about tornadoes. In 1829, a tornado goes ripping through town, a fascinating story. And even then, that meteorologist breaks into poetry in the middle of his forecast or his recounting of the weather. Like, how unusual. And then you start to hear stories of struggle and pioneer and all of that and things that we can relate to. So again, yeah, I don't go out planning for this to happen. I stumble upon it and then later make the connections like I just did, right? I'm like, wait a minute, Guelph's a place of poetry. I didn't know that going in. I didn't go, okay, there's a place of poetry. I'm going to find some poems that represent that. I would just stumble across and go, oh my goodness. And that's the interesting thing about poetry or literature or anything. I think that stuff finds you. I don't think you find it. I think when the time's right, I don't know how the universe unfolds, but I think if you just let it unfold, these things will come to you. And suddenly you'll go, there it is. There we go. And so, I don't really have a lot of spirituality in my life or anything like that, but there is something going on that I can't explain. And as I said, so suddenly these poems would find me, and I went, oh, okay, I guess I better pay attention. I guess I should listen to this. So,
I've never heard that opinion expressed, but that's fascinating. It's almost like a mathematical view of language, where people say, is math invented or is it discovered? And it's like language is the building blocks, but then once you've put together these building blocks, you start uncovering this deeper structure, and you can spend seemingly endless human lifetimes exploring that structure, just like with mathematics, right? It just keeps going deeper and deeper, and there's more
wow.
connections. And like the way you said that with the words and the poetry finds you, and people kind of describe that, right? When you're severing something in mathematics, it's like it's already there. Or maybe another analogy is a sculptor saying that he's freeing the sculpture that already exists within the block of
Yes.
granite,
Yes.
and they're just
Wow.
sort of seeing it there. And
Mm.
I wonder if there's something tapping into the language of the universe, and that physicists like to lay claim to the language of the universe as mathematics, but maybe it exists in every complex structure, like language, like math, that we come up with.
Wow. Thank you for that. Yeah, no, that's interesting. Yeah, I think you're right. I think we're onto something there. I think that's
I
very true.
I
Yeah.
also think, and I reminded you were saying there's a meteorologist from the 1820s in Guelph that was using poetry.
Yeah,
1830s.
1829.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like we've gotten so far away from that. It's almost like we tell ourselves there's poetry and there's there's right brain thinking and there's creativity, and that's all well and good, but there's a wall between that and the proper rigid right way to understand the universe. And I don't think scientists, I'd say back in the day, like scientists at the turn of the last, not the turn of the century that happened 20 years ago, but the previous turn of the century.
Yeah.
I think they were more free thinking about that. And I don't know if that's just because you could be a scientist with just, some money and some time to put towards passions, and you didn't have to do 10 years of schooling to get up to speed. But they were a lot more willing to discuss poetry and the meaning instead of just saying, well, no, you're either a journalist and you're doing cold hard facts, or you're a poet and you're a fiction writer. Um, and I don't know if that's just a problem with our institutions that have become too rigidly divided in that way,
Mm-hmm.
or I don't
Mm-hmm.
know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, of course, there's a suspicion about artistic expression that it is, as you just said, it sort of can take you away from the truth and into things that were never intended. But on the other hand, I think that we also need to bring that artistic element back because it can show us things that we didn't see before.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the thing that fascinates me about the Guelph Early Days tour is the sentences. Um, we take much pride in announcing that a movement has been made to procure the erection of a monument to the member of our good town, the celebrated John Galt, the author of Laurie Todd, The Annals of the Parish, The Steamboat, The Provost, The Lairds of Grippy, Rig and Gill Hayes, and a half dozen other piquant and racy Scotch novels which have given to their author worldwide and undying fame. Sentence number one. And it's like, oh my gosh, right? And in this day of tweets or X's or whatever they're called now, we admire short forms and we, put everything in, LOL and all that kind of stuff, where these people did the opposite. They wrote these huge, long sentences. And I find that fascinating. I love the richness of the language, and they aren't run-on sentences. They just haven't finished the whole thought. There's many thoughts within one sentence, all connected. And I really like that a lot. And as a performer, I like it too, because the challenge is you were told you don't take a breath until there's a period. So you have a sentence like that and you go, okay, now I'm going to try and say that sentence. I'm going to keep going and as long as I can and see if I can do that without. So you're learning breath control and you're connecting the language, the sentences, the writing to the physicality of your breathing. So you're making it organic and sort of in a way, right? By being hyper aware of your breathing at the same time that you're reciting. So you're not just reciting words. You also, as a performer, do I have enough breath to get to the end of the sentence, is running through the back of your mind. So all of a sudden you're going, wow, I can control many things at once. Oh, this is interesting. And at the same time, my eye contact has to be with the audience because I need to look at you in order for you to make the connection with me. But at the same time, while I'm looking at you and saying that, I'm also thinking, do I have enough breath to get to the end of this sentence? And you have no idea that I'm thinking those things. So there's so much going on. And I mean, as creatures, I find that really interesting, right? As humans, that we can operate on several planes at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. And I got all that from reading one sentence. Huh. So that's where this stuff can take you.
So you've mentioned before about how storytelling helps us reflect on different perspectives. How do you see this playing out during your tours?
It's interesting. The tours and being an actor, we've been having this discussion. I work with a number of storytellers, and they work in the oral tradition of storytelling. So their stories are never written down. Their stories are oral. You pass it on, you hear the story, you interpret it. It's like playing that game, right, where you pass a story on and then it gets passed. Yeah, and it passes around. And that's the idea, is the story grows and you add a part of yourself to the story and it builds and expands that way. Whereas because I'm approaching it as an actor, I look for really fascinating text and then recite that text as it was written. However, where storytellers and actors start to cross over is where we start bringing our own either personalities or views or opinions or whatever into it. And we might not state those opinions in it, but the way we say the word will indicate how we feel about that word. Or I'm going to try and influence you with this sentence by saying it in this either angry way or this friendly, nice way, that you will sort of react to the way I'm saying it, not necessarily to what I'm saying. And some that's where I think the storytelling component of what I do starts to come into it as well. So I don't know if I'm being clear on that because it's a very complicated thing to try and express. But to get back to what I think is the core of your question, which is how can storytelling sort of maybe help us to work together or whatever? I think storytelling is incredibly important because, and this is a word that people don't like to use, or two words that people don't like to use, civic pride. We go, ooh, that sounds a terrible, dry, awful thing. But in fact, it's a marvelous thing. People, when they work together, solve problems.
Mm-hmm.
People, when they work as individuals, can do incredible things, but they won't necessarily solve problems. If we're going to tackle problems like housing, climate change, big problems like that, the best way that we solve problems is when we work together. Oddly enough, wartime is a perfect example of that. When there's a threat and a whole bunch of us get together and say, okay, we're going to try and deal with that threat, we can do amazing things.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody has said that. Why don't we take sort of the idea of the concepts of war and look at climate change as if it's a war and then put our resources to solving that issue? And he's right in a way. We need to work collectively. We're no way are we going to beat this major threat if we all work individually and off on our own things. We need to come together and agree, not only agree on things, but share different opinions and things. And, that's the thing about climate or housing or anything. Well, some people will benefit from certain things. Well, we can't take that benefit away from you. We have to figure out how to incorporate that benefit, but also transmute it so it benefits more. And we can only do that by working together. And I think storytelling does that for us because it talks to us on a level which touches our heart, not just our brain.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that therefore it's dealing with the entire human, the brain and the heart, not just the brain or just the heart, but combining both. And the only way we can access that, our whole being, is by accessing a whole bunch of other beings that are like us.
Mm-hmm.
And then we create something that is incredible and we can do amazing things. So if we understand where we came from, if we understand how today came to be, and we look at also not only our own history, because history, a historian controls the narrative, right? So I'm going to write this part of history because this is the way I see it. Well, no, wait a minute. So history is much broader than that. History needs to be a collective of a whole bunch of different opinions coming together. And where they agree, that's the history. That's the truth. Where they disagree is all kinds of other things. And the same thing with solving a problem. So we need lots of people looking at things. I had a discussion last night, and I love going off topic, but I had a discussion last night, and the gentleman was saying, some schools have a real difficulty with people from other cultures because they are caught what we call cheating. In other words, you're sitting in an exam and you need to write the answer down. And what they do is they go, what do you think is the answer to this? Because they've come from a society where you work together to solve a problem. You don't try and work it out on your own. But we in North America see that as cheating. No, you solve the problem. Don't ask him what the answer is.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, hang on a second. This person might know something and I know something, and between the two of us we'll come up with a better answer than any one of us could come up with on our own. And I find that really interesting. I think we have to be really careful about this individualism that sort of, informs our society. We need to figure out how to work together. And the best way to work together is to share stories.
Mm-hmm.
Once you do that, you find common ground, and then you can do a lot, and you create civic pride. So suddenly your city can be a place where people go, wow, how did they solve those problems? Look at how well that Guelph is doing. How did they do that? Because we're open to sharing, and we're open to failing, and we're open to being vulnerable, and that's how you solve problems.
Well, I feel like there's a lot to unpack in that answer. And one thing that sort of resonated for me throughout your answer there was um, tying back to the reason why I wanted to start this podcast, because you know, I was born in the 90s. I've grown up and I've seen the world, um my information, the access to media and information I have, it just gets bigger. It feels like every 5 years it's like there's a new level added to it. And I don't think it's made my generation or other generations particularly happier or more connected. I think we have access to so much, and so much good and also so much bad, and it's overwhelming for our senses. um I'm a kind of a big believer in like evolutionary um biology sort of thinking, and the fact that we spent hundreds of thousands of years in small tribes that shaped our brain, and where you would know everyone. Someone you didn't know was a huge risk and a stranger to you. And I think that we'd be kind of foolish to not take those things into account, and that our modern psyche is still shaped, is in many ways we're identical to humans 100,000 years ago, but now they're living in a
Yeah,
society
yeah,
with 8 billion people.
yeah.
What does it do to the human brain when most of us start every day scrolling social media and seeing the worst that we have to offer? I don't think it's counterbalanced by the best that we have to offer. And I think there would be a real benefit to a lot of us to, not saying don't pay attention to the worldview. There's big, important things happening that need our attention, but maybe finding things that shine a light on the local point of view. So that's what the goal of this podcast is shining a light on things that are happening in your city that you could have a tangible benefit to. You can drive by. It's not hundreds of kilometers away. It's in your city. It's your neighbors. It's the people that interact in the same physical space as you interact with. And having moved back to Guelph 4 years ago, I see a lot of that collective desire for that. Like, people want to be connected, and the institutions just aren't there anymore. Like, we don't have a city newspaper.
Yeah.
We have a few dedicated journalists, but not as many as a city as our size needs.
Yeah.
And I think largely just so much of people's mental energy is spent on a bigger, wider, not even just Canada wide, that can seem small, but on such a big scale that it makes people feel helpless and powerless.
Yeah.
And there's real momentum that can be created, and just a positivity to shrinking your scale of focus and saying, like, yeah, you could put an Instagram message out there and it could reach 10,000, 100,000, 10 million people. But what if it reached 100 people in your hometown, or in the city that you live in, that are your neighbors? That there's something more real about that. And that's not to say that people in your city matter more than people outside your city, but yeah, maybe you could share, like, in your perspective, have you seen that change happen from the focus on people's day-to-day lives on a more local level, like when the Guelph Mercury was still the city newspaper, versus now when it in my perspective, it feels like everyone's sightlines are wider. And maybe you see that less because you are so focused on community driven and city based things. But
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. One of the things that I have to do in promoting Jaywalk in Guelph, I don't have a big marketing budget. So I try and take advantage of what I call free social media. I don't buy ads on social, but so I'm sending stuff out all the time. And you're starting to see social media calling themselves the town hall of something. I don't think they're the town hall of anything, because there's no human contact at all. And one of the things that bothers me about the jaywalking Guelph, and one of the reasons I'm not sure how much longer I can do this, is because I have to keep going to social media to promote myself and to send that message out. And I'm going, that doesn't work, and it's not horribly effective. So I don't know why I keep insisting on doing it. I find that usually if somebody takes one of my tours, I see them again eventually, because the personal experience is what works. If I go and speak to a number of people and I say, you should try this tour, I think you'd really, they come. Whereas the social media thing doesn't seem to do it, but it seems to be a way we keep all playing, right? We keep hoping that we'll reach people and they'll respond, and sometimes they do. There's no doubt they do, in terms of sales of tickets, if we can say that. But you're quite right when you say I feel more disconnected than ever before. And I sing in a local choir, the Guelph Male Choir. Just a year ago, I thought, that looks like fun. I think I'd like to do that. And a lot of them are seniors like myself. Most of them are older than I am. And, on Wednesday night, I go, I don't feel like going. I really don't want to go. But I guess I better go because, we have a concert coming up and I don't want to let the guys down. So I go and I do the breathing with them to get started. And we do the warm up and we sing the first song. And the next thing you know, I've totally forgotten that I don't want to go.
Mm-hmm.
And when I go home, I say to my partner, I'm so glad I went. I feel so much better. And I'm going, what's going on? Why is that? Part of the reason I don't want to go is the self-confidence thing and what do they think of me, and I don't know, all the insecurities that actors have. But at the same time, to get together with a group of people and do something together, like singing or whatever it is, and then to walk away, I feel so much better. I feel connected. I feel healthier, mentally healthier, physically healthier. It changes my attitude completely. And I think that we need to do more of that. We need to get together more. We need to put down our devices. We need to turn off that stuff and we need to go and talk to each other. That's what church used to do.
Mm-hmm.
You're talking about institutions. We don't have those institutions anymore. Not, and again, institutions can be powerful and then suddenly take you somewhere you don't want to go. But at the same time, we don't have those groups where we can do things together. And we need to do things together, whether it's a town hall or whether it's a yoga class or whether it's singing or whether it's sewing or whether it's a book club or whatever it is. We need to do things together more. It's really going to help. For me, the theater is my church, right? And it's very similar, right? You take a bunch of chairs and you focus them around somebody or a bunch of somebodies on a stage. You give them a podium or you shine a light on them and you allow them to tell their story. And, it's the same thing. And it's highly moving and it's a shared experience. And we all come out of there feeling different than we did when we went in.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, again, we need to do more of that. That's why I'm a big believer in live theater. Like, I love movies. They're fascinating. There's no doubt about it. But there's nothing like a live performance.
Mm-hmm.
To watch humans in live doing this is an incredible experience and extremely, extremely human. I don't know how else to phrase it.
The experience you have as an audience member and an observer is just so different. When you're in a movie, you on an intellectual level that even if it's a close-up, the eyes on the screen can't see you.
Yeah.
And when I remember going to, it was a Shakespeare in the Park in High Park in Toronto,
Mm-hmm.
and there was a performance of, it was King Lear. I believe this performance was a Queen Lear, and the actor just coming to the end of the stage and getting so close, and you feel like you can't breathe as an audience member because you're not just an observer. Like, you feel like you're privy to their inner thoughts and you're there for this monologue, and it's a completely different experience to a movie that, I love movies as well. I think they're one of our most interesting art forms, but there's just something different there.
Yes.
And to your point about the theater being the church, I totally understand that. I'm not a spiritual person myself. I grew up in the Catholic Church, so I'm familiar with the church and space, but I think it's overall and this isn't to denigrate the church. A lot of people get a lot of great things out of church, and churches do great things, but churches sort of through, 3,000-4,000 years of human history have taken a monopoly of that word and what that church means for a community, but surely for 100,000 more years before there was an institution that was called a church, we were getting the same thing that we need out of church at the campfire with the local
Yeah.
storyteller, with the
Yeah.
local the wise people of your tribe that would be passing down stories, and that's how they would be relaying lessons, and that's how you would be connecting. And yeah, the fact that so many people that were isolated from that as a collective, but we still keep inventing new ways to experience that. Like in the last couple of years, live streamers are a thing, right? I don't know if you're familiar. Like people started with people playing video games, but now it's just really people in front of their computer, and they have an audience of hundreds, sometimes thousands of people, and they love being connected in that way. They love sharing their opinion and being part of the community. Like clearly, no matter how much we isolate ourselves, we keep coming back together in communities. So
Yeah.
I think history will look back at this time as a interesting place where, like, oh, no wonder we were riddled with anxieties and social issues, and like look what we were
Yeah.
doing to ourselves in the isolation into nuclear families, which is a new, relatively new concept. And
Yeah.
do you can you share why you think it's important for communities to preserve and share their local history?
Boy, it's huge. um, and I think we all know. I mean, is that a complicated question, or is that a very simple question? Um, but certainly, I mean, again, what is history but knowing the stories of people before you? And the more stories you know, the more knowledge you have, the more understanding and compassion you have. Um, I think if you open yourself up to stories, then you're willing to listen to more than one story over and over because you get tired of it. But also, you also start to look for different opinions. Well, that's how that event happened, but how did they see it happen? And how did they see it happen? How did it affect them? And how did it affect? And again, so you start building that compassion, that understanding of other people's points of view. That's the interesting thing. I'm going to jump away from your question, but that's the other interesting thing about social media is that we keep expressing opinions. We're not actually changing anybody else's opinion. By doing that, all you're doing is, solidifying your opinion with other people who already agreed with you before those words were off of your keyboard. I haven't seen anybody change anybody's mind. When you see things like stop human trafficking. Oh, okay. Yeah, all right. I'll do that. Like it doesn't work that way,
Yeah.
right? It has to be a personal, this is how awful this is. Can you feel how awful this is? Yes. Would you want to do that to somebody else? No, God, no. Now you understand it because it's on an emotional level. By posting something like that, it's completely void of any feeling. I'm not saying that those posters are wrong, but and how much good are they really doing?
Yeah.
The people who are doing the human trafficking will look at that sign and continue to do the human trafficking. Like it's just not going to change their minds. And I think I think that's the anxiety, right? Is we post something and we go, there, and then nothing's changed. It's like, oh my God. And that's what I mean about, so to get back to your question about why it's important to share the stories is because we need to do that kind of stuff face to face. And when we do face to face anything, we start to understand somebody else's opinion and where they're coming from. When I look into your eyes, I can see, oh, wait, I now understand why you feel that way about the question. I saw it this way. You see it that. Oh, yeah. And that shared experience allows us to come to a compromise. And, I mean, that's the Canadian way, right? Is to compromise. but I think there's really something to that. I think that's wonderful. And what I'm seeing now is that we're not compromising. We're splitting.
Yeah.
We're just like, wait a minute. And the only way that will stop is if we all bring everybody into a room together again and start to understand.
Yeah.
And start to talk to each other face to face with body language and eye contact and compassion and open hearts and vulnerability.
Yeah, that's a big thing, right?
Myself.
Well, no, I mean when you're it's easy to solidify into two different camps when it
Mhm.
comes to why you disagree with each other. And then, but when you really sit down and you hear someone's stories, and you might still disagree, but you'll have a better understanding of where they're coming from.
Yes.
Um, do you think that people have, I wonder about this in terms of thinking about history. Has the way we think about history changed, or were people in the 1890s, would they have been just as fascinated with a tour set 100 years previous to
Mhm.
them? Would they be
Mhm.
more connected to that? I think we have
Mm.
modern ideas about how quickly things change, and you know, we kids will watch movies from the 80s and 90s and feel like just that separation from those time periods. And
Mhm.
I know something I'm always fascinated to hear about in history is we went through a time period we were uninterested in preserving the past. We you know demolished a lot of buildings because at the time it was like, well, that's an old outdated building.
Mm.
We look at the
Mhm.
buildings that we saved from that time period and we say, if only we had saved more.
Right.
But at
Right.
the time they had a thought of like, well, this is a death trap, and they could rebuild, and they wanted to move on with the future.
Mhm.
um I think there's parallels to that with conservation, which, biology and or environmental conservation didn't really even exist until, let's say 140, 150 years ago, maybe,
Yeah.
as a concept. And prior to that, it was just like, what do you mean preserve the forest? There's more forest where we have to fight back against the forest. Um, and yeah, what are your thoughts on that? Like, has the way that we we think about history changed, or is that just something that's always evolving in a?
I'm going to answer by saying I don't know. On it because I don't know. I'm not a historian.
Mm,
I don't spend. I mean, I spend time in history, but not all of my time in history. Um, so I can't really answer that. I'm not an expert. I'm not a historian. I'm not a researcher. Even I'm an actor. And even that, I'm a person who acts, right? I'm not an actor because that defines you. I'm a person who acts. At the moment, that seems to be what works for me. Um, and my stories aren't all rooted in history either.
mm.
So so that's a really tough question for me. I
Can you
can't take
speak to
that.
some of your stories that aren't like, so they're not rooted in history? Are those rooted in more modern, or are they not rooted in
Well, as I
a?
said, I mean, I came to this as an actor, and so this what I call street theater, the walking tours, was a way for me to do that. Actually, during COVID, what I was doing was pure luck. But I was the luckiest person in the world because as all my acting friends were unemployed and not working, I was doing 3 shows a week out on the street.
Mm,
20 people, distance, wearing masks outside. We can do this. And so I was really lucky because I could perform my stories while everybody else couldn't. So, that happened. But at the same time, yeah, the walking tours are one element of what I do. But I now have a one-man show called Lilt of Laughter, Trace of Tears. It was a book that was written by an old family friend. She worked for my father many years ago. She passed away in 1999. No, she passed away later than that. Anyway, doesn't matter. But she sent me a copy of the book in 1999. She passed away in 2009. Um, and when I got the book, this Lilt of Laughter, Trace of Tears, first of all, I had no idea that she was a writer. She would write skits and things for Gull Little Theater and stuff, but never, not a serious writer. But I got this book and I went, wow. And these were filled with Irish tales. I'm not Irish, but there was a lilt to the language, which is beautiful. There's a rhythm to it. There's a turn of phrase, which is so much fun, the way the Irish can do that. Um, you know, and as I read these stories, I went, these are monologues. These are meant to be said out loud. This isn't meant to be read in a room quietly. You need to, I need to lift these off the page. So I wrote to Charlene and I said, one day I want to turn this into a show. And she said, go ahead, have fun. Um, and so I have. And I took sort of 8 of the what I thought were the best stories in terms of not the best tale, but the best in terms of transferring it to a live performance. And I took 8 of them and I've strung them together with some lovely Irish tunes and sounds and sea sounds and bird sounds and stuff. And I tell these stories, and there's lots of different voices, lots of different characters. It has nothing to do with history. And yet, in a way, it does. And it's not my culture, but it is a culture. And when I tell these tales, you don't have to be Irish to understand them. The humor is funny no matter what nationality you are. The sadness, the trace of tears is touching. She talks about experiences, she talks about death and dying, and yet she'll bring a smile to your face. She talks about an Irish wake. It was a wonderful tale called Haggerty's Wake. And this young man, he dies early in life, and that's a shame, and everybody feels sorry for him. And they're standing around at the wake, and the one guy pipes up and he says, well, there's one thing he never did. He never went swimming in the whole of his life. And the next thing you know, they've lifted his body out of the coffin and they're taking him swimming. And they throw him in the water. And of course, then they lose him. And then the tide washes him in, brings him back, and they put him back in the box. And it's a hilarious story. But it's a story about death. And yet, by the end of it, you're smiling and chuckling, and it's just so amusing, and it's so human, and it's so wonderful. And again, so it's that shared experience, right? That you tell that story, and people are amused, and we can all relate, even though we probably haven't thrown any, dead relatives in the ocean. We can all relate to it. We can all understand, the fear that they went through and how upsetting it was, and yet they wanted to do something good for this person, and it's just marvelous. And so through that, that's what I do. That's what I love to do, and find great stories. Again, when I read the book, I went, the writing is so good. Wow. The way she, the turns of phrase, as I said, it's just so many interesting things, and all the different voices. There's so many different characters in each story. And there's even one called Now the Widow Herself, and there's a Fiddler O'Flaherty. Poor Fiddler O'Flaherty, 70-something years old, and he's in love. And his final words are, oh, God, it's bad. When even getting old's no cure for love. The poor guy is just, oh, my gosh. And then we hear her side and about her. And so I play the widow, which is all kinds of fun. And so I'm really loving doing that, and that has nothing to do with history at all. So, that's where when you start asking me these questions about history, I go, I don't know, because I don't spend all of my time in history.
Well, I guess one of the most important lessons we can learn from history is that the people of the past weren't that different from us today.
Yeah.
They had different customs and they grew up in different environments. Yeah. But if you'll lose a lot if history is just facts on paper for you as opposed to
absolutely. As a student, and I'm sure you feel the same way. And history, I hated it because it was just numbers. In 1842, this happened. Something called the Family Compact. I don't even know what that is, but I'm supposed to remember what that is. And there's this battle that I don't know why it's significant and what that's about and who the prime minister was, and it just doesn't make any sense. And then suddenly I had a history teacher in grade 11, I think, who we dug into the stories. We dug into the people. And it was like, now the date has a significance. Now I understand. So now I can remember it, right? The same thing as when you're trying to memorize words, memorize script. When it suddenly rings true to something inside you, there we go. I can remember that phrase now easily. But it has to make that connection.
Right.
And so that was the thing. So history, same thing with Shakespeare, right? Oh my God, I don't understand the language until somebody brings it to life for you. And then you go, oh. And my own ignorance is getting in the way of me experiencing that. So I'm going to change my ignorance about the language so that I can learn more about that, because it's really neat.
Yeah.
And that's how that works, right?
I'm sure I had an experience with Shakespeare, probably similar to a lot of people. I might have been in grade 9 or 10. And we had been studying Shakespeare, reading through the text. I forget the exact play. Maybe it was Romeo and Juliet.
I was going to say Romeo and Juliet.
Probably. We went to go see a performance in Stratford at the Stratford Festival.
Yeah.
And the one who's is it Romeo's cousin? Who's he's sort of a um he's like a big character, or is it Juliet's cousin? Anyway, he's a big character. He's very he's actually kind of he's like he's joking all the time, and he's very lewd and sexual in a way.
Yes.
None of that came across on the page for me, and then seeing this actor bring it to life, and
Yeah.
it's like, oh, there's so much in the text that is lost if you're just reading it versus having hear it performed. And it sounds like with your new one man show that it must be really gratifying to breathe new life into what was meant to be ultimately a performance out loud, or maybe that's where I don't know if it's meant to be, but that's a way that it can be transformed as opposed to just being like locked away on a shelf.
Well, that's the interesting thing about Charlene Harold, is that she spent a lot of time in theater, and then she wrote a book. And I think what happened was she didn't realize that she was actually crossing over, and no, that isn't meant to be a book. That's meant to be a play.
Right.
That's meant to be told out loud. It's meant to be performed. Although, again, she balances it really interesting, because they're not necessarily monologues. Like, the person breaks the fourth wall all the time. So it's kind of an odd thing. But again, these characters are so deep, so rich, so broad, so human, that only part of it you can capture on paper. And you're right. When somebody, I like to think myself, brings these people, makes them three-dimensional, it's like, so many more people can share in the experience. And I know from audience reaction that everybody is touched by these people and charmed by these people more than they would be if they just read the book.
Yeah.
So again, it's magic. Yeah.
Well, I think this is a question that you've already touched on many times, but what sort of advice would you have for our audience, for people who are hoping to establish and build a community around them? What's your advice, and what have you learned in your career for successfully doing that?
That's one of those tricky questions too, right? So what should we do? And how can we solve this? And, if I had the answer to that, I'd be a millionaire. We used to say that in theater all the time. What's the secret to the box office success? Well, if I had the answer to that, I'd be successful, wouldn't I? And I wouldn't share that secret with you. But how do we build community? I think just follow your instincts. I think a lot of us know. For example, I think a lot of us know when we're spending too much time on social media. I think a lot of us know that I'm being disconnected. I think a lot of us feel guilty the moment we hit send on that opinion piece that we sent to the Guelph Today or whatever. When I sent that opinion, I shouldn't do that anymore. And I think that. And I think so. Just be self-aware and listen to yourself, feel yourself. And if you feel that anxiety, notice when that anxiety is happening. When you don't want to go to singing class, when you don't want, that's the time you should go. When you don't want to do your yoga, that's the time you should do your yoga. Those things. And I think just be aware of that. Be kind to yourself. That's important too. Don't beat yourself up over it. Just notice, you know what, that was, okay, well, I won't do that again for now, and we'll see what happens. So be kind to yourself and engage with people as much as you can. Even if, actors are typically, right, social anxiety really high. Yeah, I can get in front of 100 people and talk. In a way, it's not me. I don't know how to explain that, and I'm sure you've heard those stories before. But at the same time, I have to force myself to get out of my bubble and engage with people, even though I have social anxiety, even though I don't like going to parties and talking to people and stuff. But just do it. Just expose yourself. You'll get better at it. You'll get more confident, and you'll become more understanding of other people. And you'll discover that there's a whole bunch of people in that room who really didn't want to be there and really felt uncomfortable. But as we all became more comfortable, we all enjoyed the experience. And I think whether that's a party or a get-together or a family gathering or a town hall or an event downtown, just do it. Just try it. Get out there. Get out there and experience life.
That is great advice, and I know I am by no means an expert on it, but I've seen success in my own life in terms of a lot of things can be reframed. So the fear, that the anxiety of the what if, I kind of want to do this thing, but what if it goes bad? What if it goes wrong? In a lot of ways, that fear is psychologically and physiologically identical to excitement. And there's an analogy that I don't know where I heard it, but it was a great analogy. And it was talking about in the middle of a workout, like a heavy workout, objectively, your body can feel kind of awful, but you're energized by it and you know why you're feeling that way. And it can be the best feeling in the world. If you woke up in the middle of the night feeling that exact same way, not knowing why you're feeling it, you would think you were dying. But objectively, the body could be experiencing the same thing. And I think a lot of people are successful at reframing that fear that they get. So like you were saying, like, you don't want to do a thing, you don't want to step out onto a stage, but if you can trick yourself, or even maybe just trick, some of it's just the language that we use internally, where like you don't want to do it because you're afraid of it. Well, that fear is good. That's your body not wanting to, your brain doesn't want to do it badly.
Yes.
But don't let it stop you from stepping out there.
Yes.
You're going to remember your own issues or something that didn't go over well way better than other people are going to remember, and they're just going to remember the good things largely. And but yeah, I think that's a good takeaway, is to just put yourself out there. Everyone is afraid, even the people who look like they're at ease in the world. A lot of times they are riddled with that same fear and anxiety, and you can use that as a connection point.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, Jay, thanks so much for joining me today. Is there, if our viewers want to learn more about yourself, your tours, what you're offering, where can they go? Where can I direct them?
Yeah, sure. So the easiest thing to remember is Jaywalking Guelph. So you just put that into your browser, and jaywalkingguelph.ca will come up, and you'll find me. So I think that's the best way. That's why I came up with the name. I thought it made a lot of sense. Yeah, I'm jaywalking. And it appeals to me too, because I'm breaking the rules, but a little bit, only a little bit. Yeah.
And your one man show, how long is that going on for? And is there
that one is sort of, I'll do it on request. I can do a 10-minute version of it at a house party, or you can come and see a performance. I haven't booked any recently, but look for it next spring. It's going to go on tour. I like to play community halls, little small community hall. Again, this idea of connecting and community. And there's these community halls sitting out there, and they almost all disappeared. Fortunately, they're sort of coming alive again. And so I love those venues because they hold about 40 people, and it's a wonderful shared experience. And the community comes out, and we have a laugh together. So just keep looking. Again, Google Jaywalking Guelph, and you'll see stuff come up.
That's great. Well, I'll make sure all the links are in the episode description.
Thank you.
But yeah, thanks a lot, Jay.
Thank you, Jordan. I've really enjoyed today. Thanks very much.